When you look across the business environment in particular, I know you spend a lot of time in that, what are you seeing in terms of leadership? Good things and bad things?
So I have a strong opinion on that, actually, Gary.
Good.
The prevalence of autocracy, really, in the style of leadership and the default in the system. If we're going to do this, which is change the mindset from this fattening geese type economy to focusing on delivering products and services for customers and then managing the wealth through employee-owned trusts, then we have to then go back to school. It's dog eat dog. It's, we're going to have this deal, and if I put food on my table and you don't get food on yours, that's okay. You could equally say that someone like Muhammad Ali would just be, it's a delusion. I could sit here now and say I'm the greatest.
Yeah.
So what?
Welcome to the Business Sense podcast. I'm Gary Crosby. This is the podcast where we make sense of the business journey by talking to owners about what they've learned along the way. Let's jump into today's episode. All right, thanks for joining me today, Richard.
Thank you, Gary. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited about exploring the leadership topic with you because there's a lot going on. I'm thinking about the general state of leadership in our country. I know that's quite a big topic, but when you look across the business environment in particular, I know you spend a lot of time in that. What are you seeing in terms of leadership? Good things and bad things?
You know, the thing that dawns on me at the moment is the prevalence of autocracy, really, in the style of leadership and the default in the system. And in bad sense, for me, that's something that I think we all need to be aware of now and somehow attend to it in a positive way rather than take it on or call it out in a, you know, it's bad, particularly it's a case of, well, what would be better? But every day I'm amazed by individual pockets of leadership. There are leaders out there showing up and doing good things and the right thing. You know, let's just take a sporting environment. So someone like Marcus Rashford, for example, stands up amidst, you know, the scenario of people needing to be fed, and he leads. And so leadership exists.
So if autocracy is becoming a bit of a default, what's causing that? Is it just the pure pursuit of profits, or is there something in the characters of the leaders themselves that leads to that?
I'd say my instant answer is it's both. And so let's just say if in a leader's mindset we're fighting ourselves, you know, the inner conflict in man, and all roads lead to the corruption lies within, effectively the leader's job is to identify that default and somehow, you know, let's become enlightened leaders as opposed to egotistical, arrogant, autocratic, because it's the complete opposite of what the leadership role is there for.
So where do people like, you know, I mean, leadership is, or history is scattered with good leaders that have been written about a lot, but when we look at today's modern leaders, people like Elon Musk who march into Twitter and just sack a huge cohort of people and all that sort of stuff, where does that behaviour come from?
Let's just say it's natural unless it becomes attended to. If we default to, you know, our lower selves, if you want to put it that way, we're allowed to get on with it and nothing stops us, then history will be littered with, you know, leadership that self-corrupts, and it doesn't matter whether that's political or business. And so where does it come from? I'm going to suggest, again, it's inside us to be transformed. And that is the essence of leadership for me, is we have to work out what's good for humans. Unfortunately, in our business environment, I would suggest that having looked at this in a deep way and over a long period of time, that the system has actually accepted, through ignorance almost, the default mode. And that it is seen as an entrepreneur to make money and get on is a good thing.
And does that come from the business schools? Does it come from the coaches and mentors, the leaders that people take over from? Is it what leads to that kind of behaviour?
Let's just say I've always had a natural kind of I'm just going to say, sense of integrity. I don't see myself in terms of public leadership, or I don't have a great sense of self. I don't have a need to be seen. And in leadership terms, for me, the nature of humility is that you wouldn't want that. You actually just show up when you need to show up. But some of these things, they're not really taught at the character level. Lots of training, lots of education, if you will, is driven by the outcome side. It's performance. We need profit tomorrow. We need this tomorrow. Yeah. And it's done from an outside in point of view. And it really doesn't engage the character. And, you know, I mean, as you know, Gary, I was in a brief spell in a military environment. And if that 5 years I just packaged now as saying, well, that was really about character of leadership. Because it was in a military environment, which is actually a totally different application of service and raison d'etre, if you will, to business. But from a character point of view, I ended up at the end of a 3-day exercise on Salisbury Plain, absolutely out of energy, completely, you know, up against the wall. Everyone else had scarpered back to the billet, and I was the last man standing. And I had a great old rant at the major in front of me. And he had no compassion or empathy whatsoever. He just said, fundamentally, you know, character of leader is that this needs to be done. You're here. That's what we need to do. Service at the core.
So you mentioned, you know, outside in. If we were to think about leadership, I know in our preliminary conversations before this, you mentioned that, you know, good leadership starts with self-leadership. So let's just explore that, because that feels to me a little bit like inside out. What do you mean when you talk about self-leadership?
So I think it's as simple and basic as each person in their own role. If we think about an economy where everyone's involved, it's everyone in their own role needs to do a good job. It's the basics of good standards, you know, doing a job right, all of that basic stuff. So that I use it quite a lot in just leadership language, but the process of washing up at home before the machines, right? You can either have the kids send dirty dishes to the other side, and you allow it to happen, or you can send it back and say, look, actually, we need to get this right first time. And that basic mindset of a standard, it doesn't matter then whether you're in a leadership role, every job has to have that core standard. But in the systems and businesses and teams that I've ever been a part of, I want everyone to lead themselves. I want them to do a perfect job. I want them to have a pride in that job. And I think that leadership starts in each team member to self-lead. And then within that context, the classic understanding of leadership is those that are more capable, more flexible, have some sort of glue gift to knit a team together. For sure, they show up. But I don't think that the showing up leader is more important than the members of the team.
So going back to the inside, I mean, people have got to be sure in their own purpose, I guess. They've got to develop their own identity. They've got to set their own mindset. Do we train that into people, or do we just look for people that have got that already?
So I have a strong opinion on that, actually, Gary.
Good. Welcome to my podcast.
Well, because the old mantra is that, you know, leaders are born and not bred. And I've been in leadership training and development for the last 20 years directly, and then, you know, indirectly as part of any leader's job is to train and succession plan. So let's
create new leaders.
To create new leaders. That's 40 years in the game. And in that sense, for me, it's everyone's job to train leaders. And I've got a numerous amount of stories about, you know, where people that are natural leaders will get on anywhere. But in the bell curve, if you like, of life, the big majority in the big part of the bell curve, it's a learned behavior where it's like priming a pump. You've just got to make it happen a bit, and then people get it. And if the majority of the bell curve is happening, then we've got a society or a system or an organization which is working. So I do believe that we have to consistently train leadership.
And do you come across a lot of people who essentially aren't really aware of themselves? And perhaps some of the training is about making them more self-aware. And as they get that self-awareness, then they suddenly start to see the world in a different way.
I'd say it's totally that, Gary. If you say that over a life, let's just say any of us that keep moving and keep learning, whether it's a character phase, but maybe we have to learn courage today. Maybe it's a character thing, or maybe it's a humility thing. That will come along at a passage of time. Whereas maybe we're taking on a first line management role and we haven't done that before. That'll be a capacity level of development.
Yeah.
But 10 years beyond, we might be a senior manager, or we might be owning our own business. And so that's a different capacity. But when we get into the role that we're about to approach, let's just say eras come in 3, 5, 7 year type phases. Once we're in the job, then we need a performance level engagement of development. So we've got most of it. We've got the right attitude, perhaps the right approach if it's done proactively. It needs a performance help, so that we need to be better at the final 10%. The difference that makes the difference. And these are different phases for me of continuous ongoing leadership development.
I mean, I see people whose identity shifts. So they do the learned behavior stuff. They commit to learning and self-improvement. They make themselves more aware of their strengths and weaknesses. Maybe they've got, behavioral tests or other things that suddenly make them more aware of what they think about themselves and what other people think about them. But in the end, their mindset has to shift with it. And I go back to one of the greatest self-validations of them all. I am the greatest. Muhammad Ali said that long before he was ever winning anything. So do leaders have to, inside their own mind, begin to think of themselves as a different identity, a different leadership identity?
It's a great question, because I don't think it's got a simple answer, actually. But the short point is probably how I want to speak around it is, I think in the end, whatever phase we're in, we have to find a way to live it. We have to live the role that we're in. So you could equally say that someone like Muhammad Ali would just be, it's a delusion. I could sit here now and say I'm the greatest. So what? Whether I believe it or not might help me. If I really believe it, then it will probably help me to be the greatest. But I might not. I've come across thousands of people that would say that they're the greatest. And they would be my, let's say, the most difficult client. And it's that whole congruence needed between perhaps somebody like Muhammad Ali, who had a natural capacity, Usain Bolt, for example. He could naturally say he was the greatest. And that would be a congruence. I think we need to find the right level of belief for what we're attending to now, so that we actually can live the embodiment of our leadership or our role.
And I think back to my experience in the military, where you wore a uniform that kind of visualized for everybody else the leadership position that you were in. But didn't always match the person, which is an interesting concept.
Well, I mean, if I used to, as an officer, if I was wearing number 1 dress on parade, for example, and taking parade, there was a disconnect between the role and actually my self-belief. Okay? And it was simply that I could hold the function of doing a parade, but actually it was just something I had to do. It wasn't where I saw the essence of my beliefs or what I was there for.
And when you think about emotional intelligence, I mean, it's an industry in and of itself. When we talk about self-leadership and the idea that we should live into the role that we're in, what role does emotional intelligence play, do you think?
So it's actually an integral part, isn't it, of being human. And I can remember, as a kid, I'm of that era where we didn't talk about emotions. Your dad patted you on the back as a sort of a form of endearment. There was no big old man hugs or any of that stuff. But actually, the modern generation would say, oh, there was some lack of ability in there. And I'd say, my old man had deep love. It's just that he didn't necessarily show it. But in my world, I didn't need him to show it. But if you then translate that into emotional capacity and flexibility, I think it's paramount to have the whole range and awareness of the emotional dimension. So if we talk about ourselves holistically, spiritual, mental, emotional, physical beings, the part of the self-awareness equation is to understand all of those parts and how they work.
Do you ever come across anybody who isn't really aware of the impact that they have on others?
How long have you got?
So, thinking that as one of the core tenets of emotional intelligence, you understand yourself, you've got emotional regulation, which I think is one of the most powerful things that business leaders can have in particular. But then you have to understand the impact that you have on others. And a lot of people, I think, have lived their lives without having that explained to them, and they might not see it themselves.
I think it's a natural part of all person's level of leadership, and I think it's a timeless thing. I don't think that's going to be a one-off, but when it gets back to the issue of, say, autocracy, I see and lots, and I don't mind saying it in the modern world, it's men, and I'm not saying it's not women, but I am saying that it's a men thing, where if you end up in an autocratic type mindset where it's disengaged from the connectivity of the human group, you're not coming from leadership of the heart. The heart has basically got a veil over it. You've taken 2 or 3 steps back inside you. There's not that natural connection and glue. And for me, you can't have integrity leadership without it.
But if you take the other end of the spectrum, you mentioned at the beginning autocracy and democracy. What does democratic leadership look like?
So, I'm going to say I've been lucky enough to be in environments where democratic leadership was mostly present, or we were allowed to somehow have a pocket of democracy irrespective of what was going on around us. That might sound like it's a bit either maverick or anti-authority, but I don't believe that it is. In fact, the whole way that I think that our world can change is that individuals adopt democracy anyway, and literally you carry on in that natural mode until somebody stops you. And if you get stopped, you have to have a conversation, hopefully. And if the conversation leads to a place where authority and power gets in the way, you end up in a crossroads and a choice point. And then that's, one of those moments. But if you're going to be yourself, and I happen to believe humans are more democratic beings than they are autocratic, the mindset I had, and I don't know about you, Gary, but, when we question leadership and you ask questions, one of the very early questions I had was, if you're brought up in a loving family to basically nurture, get the best out of each other, rub along, have humility, be sensitive, stand out. Each of us have our moment in a family, right? When you then go out to the work environment, it seems that the world is completely upside down. You then need to go, it's dog eat dog. It's, we're going to have this deal, and if I put food on my table and you don't get food on yours, that's okay in the business world.
Yeah.
And I can't live with that conflict, or I didn't live with the conflict. And so the authentic me is not somebody that says, right, I'll go, home and practice loving family, and then I'll go into a working environment and somehow become top dog. Because that's just the fight to the death.
That's really fascinating, because of course I'm racking my brain as you're speaking there to think about examples of democratic leadership and trying to light on examples of where people have employed that kind of system in their business and still been successful. I'm not saying the two are clearly contradictory, but have you got any examples of genuinely democratic leaders that you've helped maybe in your time and they've run a great profitable company?
So I'll answer that question directly, and then we can put some depth to it if we need. Having been brought up in the business environment, fundamentally from the age of 21, starting at Cadbury, which were seen at the time to be, leaders in their field in terms of social capitalism, if you will.
Yes.
And I was lucky enough to start work in the company where there was still family leadership. So Sir Adrian Cadbury and Dominic Cadbury were chairman and CEO. Now, there were 12,000 people of us going to Bourneville. There were about 36,000 around the globe in Cadbury Schweppes. 12,000 of us. We were all races, religions, colours, personalities. We had one canteen. We literally went to the same, canteen, and everything was shared. You could sit next to a stranger for lunch. You could walk up what was called at Cadbury the crush hall, and your colleague that you hadn't met ever before would turn right and go off to pack something like cream eggs, whereas you might carry on, as I was in those days, and make Whisper bars. And we were all in it together, and there was a whole sense of esprit de corps. There was a whole common purpose, and for sure, with a competitive mindset, if you will, Mars were our enemy, And in our chocolate industry, it was that we believed that our chocolate was better than the Mars bar. Now, I do have some maturity now that says that there is room for everybody. But as a young Turk,
yes,
but democracy in that sense was endemic to that system under the family. It changed. So when it got sold out, the spirit changed. The complete fabric of the organization changed, and it became, in my world, and I don't shy away from the language, a capitalist monster. And people suddenly didn't want to go to work.
So going back to the days when it was family owned, and I'm thinking about the institutional culture there, because it could have been that those two people at the head of the company were, into culture, into values. They espoused those values, and the company, all the way down through the company, those were evident. Or it could have been that there was an institutional, long-term, decades-old institutional sense of what was right and what was wrong, and the leadership comes
absolutely
from the bottom up.
Absolutely. And here's the thing, and this is the longevity point, and it's also the reason why not to do short term. If you then say that, look, I started work on a bank holiday Monday. My first day at work was a bank holiday Monday, and I was taught by what you and I might call just warm uncles. Not my DNA uncle, but just men. And Peter, he'll have to forgive me. I'll find it, but his surname I don't remember. But he was, curly white haired, the loveliest, warmest bloke you want to come across. He'd been a first line manager all his life, and he taught me how to. Right. Then there was a chap called Jack Fisher. He was what they used to call in those days the superintendent on night shift. So I'd be running a part of the Cadbury chocolate factory. When I get into problems with either men or don't know what to do, I go and see Uncle Jack Fisher.
Wow.
And he would spend time. I'd sit in a chair, perhaps a little bit like this, but it felt in those days like my legs never touched the floor. He was about 6'4", and I'm only about 5'8".
Yeah.
So, but he would impart wisdom, but only based on my questions and my sort of challenge. And so I was mentored, if you will, from an early age in the line. And that was endemic to the whole of the Cadbury culture.
Which is interesting because, my experience was in the Air Force for 30 years, but some of the frontline fighter squadrons in particular had squadron uncles, and that's what they were called. Yeah. These would have been respected senior people who were, very good at their job, not on the career path, if you like, pushing to be the chief of the air staff or anything like that, but they were people that could be trusted. You could go to them with issues and challenges and problems and training questions and anything like that. So that kind of leadership still exists, even in a modern technical force like the RAF.
Yeah. And for me, but this is fundamental to people understanding the fabric of an institution that needs those things. I mean, if I can, wind the clock forward, so I think the line of question we're on here is about what makes a democratic organisation. And, we can see here it's not just about, say, the decision-making of, democracy, at that level. But implicit in what we've just spoken around is these uncles, is that I was given a patch of a factory to look after, and the authority and the accountability and so on. So in a democratic sense, I'd already been trusted to do a job, right? So as a leader, I had to show up. If there was a fire, I'd have to sort it out.
Yeah.
If there was somebody nicking chocolate, which I've had several times.
Must have happened at Cadbury's a lot.
Well, yeah. And so somebody on my shift lobbing cream eggs over the perimeter fence into a white van on the other side. And, you know, as a leader, I have to deal with that and see that not right. Okay. But I'm going to mention a company called Scott Barder. They're based in Northamptonshire, near Wellingborough. And they are, in my world, leaders of the business model, which most people might understand more through things like the John Lewis partnership model.
Yes.
But even that is coming under a little bit of, we'll call it test at the moment, in an ideology sense. But Scott Barder was a founding company in something which is called the employee-owned trusts.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm familiar.
And let's just say implicitly, by saying the word employee-owned trust, it's got democracy implied in it. Now, let's just say that organisation's been around for well over 100 years, but 50 or 60 years now as an EOT, as they call it. There is now something called the Employee Ownership Association, and I tracked their membership numbers from about 2007, 8, 9, that era, where there would be a scant few, 100, 200, 300 members. It was just something that was a seed organisation. Well, suddenly it's kicked off. They've now got 1,200 members. Suddenly, in the last 3 years, the membership of people looking to go EOA has taken a kick. And it's lovely to see. Yeah. Because there's an undercurrent in there. And when you asked the question earlier, Gary, and say, look, you know, where do you see good and bad leadership? Let's just say I can't see the detail of each of the decisions that are going on to translate or to move an organisation into an EOA or EOT constitution. But what I can say is, in the modern world, that's still a courageous decision to make. Because it's not what most people are doing.
No. And do those EOTs, I mean, they're naturally democratic by the very structure.
Yeah.
But do they still have to have a sensible business hierarchy? They still have to have a clear path, a clear purpose. They can't be, fully democratic in the sense of everybody having a say in what's going on. How are those trusts led effectively?
It's a fascinating area for me, and it is actually where I now spend all of my time. So I've literally moved only to helping democratic organisations. I used to help anyone that wanted to be helped. So if I got, the biggest tyrant on the planet wanting to change the outcome and the level of life in his or her business, I'd help. Now I'm 62 years old. I don't have time left to help in that way.
Yes.
So I put all my energy into this area. It's actually at some level quite simple, but at another level it's quite confusing for us human beings that would default naturally into autocracy if not educated or helped in another way. If you look at the more mature organisations in the EOT space, you've got to square the circle where fundamentally each person has to be an owner.
Right.
And in the ownership mindset, you're creating the environment within which you then step into with your, we'll call it functional head on, to go to work. And they're two different parts of ourselves. And in the era that I was certainly born into, what I identify as this autocratic leaning, this conflict or this naturalness is never allowed to come out. It's not allowed to flower because to have an employee owner suggests I've now got a vote about whether it's an existential vote. Are we to exist or not exist? And if you're to have each of us sat we'll call it a membership environment first. So you join this company as a member, as a human being first, not as an employment contract. The problem in my world with our legal constitution of the capitalist world is I was always from authority and autocratic management point of view and institutions mindsets, I was not a person first, right? I was a contract first. The fact that I had a capacity to not be just a contract meant that I could be my authentic self. Not everyone found that sort of path. Whereas in a EOT environment, and here's the rub, is that many would not believe that they could be an owner. They've been conditioned to be dependent upon somebody else telling them what to do and their identity. Yeah. So you have to educate us. You can't just say we're going to become an EOT and then think it's all going to work. No. It doesn't.
No.
And so you've got this membership base where our identity is we're owners. And as owners, we then have this vote where we could choose to create a different economic system even, not the one that we've got. The consequence of capitalism for the last 50 and 200 years for me is absolutely connected with climate change. It's connected with rich and poor.
Yes.
It's connected with all the things that anyone would try and put a finger on. And when we listen to the political class just going round and round and round in a circle, nobody actually puts their finger on the root cause. And if in the business world, leaders like ourselves, Gary, are here to show up fundamentally to point this stuff out, we can start to create a system from a different level.
And I know you founded the @One Academy, and you've talked about the @One economy. I think there's a book in draft at the moment.
There is, yeah.
What do you mean by the @One economy?
Well, I suppose it's one of those things that, let's say, it's been sitting in there for a long time, but at a very simple level, there's 7 billion people on this planet. And in a work sense, a vocational sense, any of us that are in the business environment, our job is to provide goods and services for other human beings. Okay? It's as simple as that.
Yes.
The problem is that the business schools, the mindset that, let's just say, we've got a soft underbelly as a human. If someone doesn't point it out, and you go into a working environment, or like I did, I joined Cadbury's and I went and did what I did. But then I said, look, I wanted to be a general manager. So I trained to be an accountant.
Right.
So I'm a qualified SEMA accountant. I was a finance director of a 100 million turnover FTSE 100 company, Geese Bananas. Okay. But my learning in there would be to pour through about 8 fat books of detail, which I don't question. Yeah. I've simply been fed a diet, which is the wisdom handed over of 200 years, which I accept at that stage to be right. Now, why would I, or who would I be any different if I've got no other education? And
so are you proposing an alternative then? Is that what the @One economy?
It is, and so the alternative is that 7 billion people on this planet, if we were all part of EOT, employee-owned trusts, that is a vocation and a profession, anyone that went to work, for example, in a business, was not there in a system to build fat balance sheets, okay, and to flog off the goose. So, I call it sort of a system of goose laying golden eggs, and the capitalist world basically wants to own the goose, and if they can sell a goose that's going to die tomorrow, right, for a price of 5 years on it, they think that's a good deal.
So, Morrison's
would
be a good example.
Manchester United Football Club.
Yeah. So what will this book propose then? Are we saying that there is now in the modern world there should be a transition into this @One economy, or that we should be able to pick from the best parts of the @One economy and apply it to ourselves and to our businesses? What would you like to see as an outcome?
So it is simply that there's this alternative model and it's not, let's just say it's not me. I think that all of these things are here to be found, and so I've got great teachers, and I've read from various backgrounds, but there is an element of putting it together. So there's a chap called John Ruskin from about 1864.
Yeah.
He's got a fantastic foundation for why this should exist. But I happen to believe that we should have an alternative economic system, that employees should be aware. Every person, every family, every child should know that if they go into an organization which is run by autocracy, there's a certain consequence to what happens. If you want to go into an organization where you're no worse off economically, because if you, for example, say the binary choice is that you go into an organization that cares about its product and service and customers, and you do well at that, you have to make a sustainable margin in any business. Okay, it could be 10%, 20% margin. Once you've got wealth, a sustainable business simply recycles that wealth into its raison d'etre. It forward future paces the raison d'etre and keeps that going for as long as it's relevant for human beings. And if we end up, for example, on a shift where candle makers, right, aren't needed because electricity's arrived, then guess what? We have to work out that it's time to switch the light off. So there isn't any guarantee that our business will sustain. But if we look at the basic need of us as humans, food, energy, health, all of those things, these are timeless services. All you want in this is people that love it, want to do it well, and don't want to sell the goose off.
Does that start in your mind then in our education system?
Totally.
But, both at the start and in our business education system?
Yeah.
And does the book that you're writing, does that address that issue? What will I get from reading it?
It basically I've got a friendly old uncle called Peter Thompson, who's, if he'll ever listen to what we're speaking about here, he'll like it, because, it's like lots of these things. He puts out podcasts day in, day out. I don't tell him what I've listened to, and I haven't. I used to go to his, what was called the CDN network back in the early 2000s. He taught me how to put proposals together, how to sell, and some of this thing. Okay. The book focuses on the essence of, we'll call it, the solution, rather than me being the person that knows how anyone's going to read it and pick it up.
Okay.
But it in the back end of what is 9 chapters, I basically do say, if we're going to do this, which is change the mindset from this fattening geese type economy to focusing on delivering products and services for customers, and then managing the wealth through employee-owned trusts, then we have to then go back to schools. But I'm not a school teacher. I don't know those environments. I'm quite happy to go and stand and speak in schools, but going back to self-leadership, I'm only one man with 40 hours a week, and I know my limitations as much as my, responsibilities and capacities. Anyone who reads the book that thinks that they can do a job in that sort of area, I hope that in a leadership sense, they'll put their hand up and show up.
And just to finish off, because we're coming to the end now, but I know that something else that you've talked about before is enabling leadership. And I imagine that as people are thinking about, the at-one economy, and they're thinking about themselves, and they're thinking about the way that they create new leaders and things like that, enabling leadership is going to play a part in that. What are the key points of focus in enabling leadership from your perspective?
The fundamental, I use the label enabling leadership because it's fundamentally a teaching approach. It's a coaching approach. So if you and I look at the types of leaders we'll come across, you'll get micromanagers, you'll get people that can't get off the tools, you'll get people that are just attached to the tangible stuff.
Definitely.
Well, I was always somebody in Cadbury. I'll go back to Cadbury. I couldn't do any of the jobs in the Whisper plant. All right, I had 70 people. I couldn't do any of their jobs. So what could I do? I could only enable them individually and as a whole. Yeah. So I had it ingrained pretty early on. But it is, for me, in a leadership sense, to put yourself to a place where you have the resources in your team to do what you say you're going to do, and the leader moves to a place where they can enable each of those individuals to be their better selves, and that the team or group as a whole can be their better selves, and that you've literally made time to be that enabling leader. If you're not putting yourself in a coaching, facilitation, training type role, your team will gradually end up a dead end, stuck, blind. It won't be able to function, and it is a natural part of leadership. When you then take that to a systemic level, the mature approach for leadership for me is what I call coaching in the line. So in Enrich You, as the business that I set up, what we go and do is get whole organizations of leaders, bodies of 30, 40, 50 people coaching in the line. So they're all enabling in style.
Coaching in the line. I like that. I like that. Because, of course, that's in my experience, that's the way that you suddenly discover that some of the people that work for you are capable of much more than you think they are.
Totally. Totally.
It was one of the abiding memories of my time in the Air Force was, having junior officers coming onto my squadron and giving them jobs that were potentially way outside of their capacity, and suddenly realizing that not only could they do it, but they could do it really well. So I may have been coaching when I didn't realize it in that environment. Good. Well, look, Richard, 40 minutes doesn't do it justice. We could talk for hours, but I'm absolutely delighted that you took the time to come in today, and I really thank you for sharing your views on leadership.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks.